Authentication and user management are two of the most consequential features in any Next application. We, as developers, have to give our users a modern and frictionless authentication experience with all the features they've come to expect, while also taking responsibility for the security. This is all, by the way, with the Next app router, which introduced a new paradigm where we toe this line between server and client components. That creates questions like, how do we address cross-cutting concerns like authentication in a clean and secure way? In the next 10 minutes, you will accomplish it all as we set out to add authentication to a minimal word learning concept based on a blank Create Next app. In this video, you will learn Clerk, which is a user management platform with designated Next middleware and React components like sign in, sign up, and user button that we will embed to get up and running quickly while also maintaining flexibility over the presentation and the user experience. My name is Alex, and my goal is to help you feel confident about how to use Clerk and in the security that it provides. So along the way, I'm going to sprinkle in some lesser known tips about Clerk that I learned speaking to the team internally. Let's get started. And as always, if you'd like to support the Clerk YouTube channel, please make sure you hit that subscribe button. We'd love to have you on board. I've created a blank Create Next app with the smallest sliver of styling and placeholder text. There's no logic, there's certainly no authentication logic, because we're going to code that together one step at a time. The first step is to create a Clerk account if you haven't already, then an app called Word Warehouse. Here we can configure our sign-in options. I'm going to keep it simple and only enable the username option, but if you wanted to add social options like GitHub, all you have to do is flick the switch. To get started, let's first install the Clerk Next SDK. While that's installing, copy the environment variables over to an env.local file in the root directory. These identifiers are unique to each app, and they're how we link the Clerk Next SDK to the Clerk app we just created in the dashboard. Next up, copy over middleware TS. If you're using the source directory like me, pop middleware TS in there. If you're not using the source directory, middleware TS has to go into the root alongside env.local. A bit later, we'll come back here and learn more about the role of Clerk Next middleware and how to protect specific pages of our application. For now though, continue on to layout.tsx and surround the roots of the app in a Clerk context provider. Notice how my editor has helpfully auto-imported @Clerk/Next.js. That's perfect. Be mindful though that sometimes your editor will auto-import or invite you to import the Clerk React package, which is not compatible with Next, even though it shares some of the same components. When we wrap the root of our app in a Clerk provider like this, it means that Clerk components become accessible throughout the entire app. Some components like signed out are what we call helper components. That means they don't render any new UI, but they still help us by conditionally rendering their children. In this case, we can say that if the user is signed out, we will render a Clerk sign in button. We can also say that if the user is signed in, we will show a user button. Back in the browser, the user can now click sign in to authenticate via the Clerk account portal. I'm Booker, my email is as follows, and my password is, well, I'm not going to tell you that. Notice that with Clerk, email verification is enabled by default. I'll copy my code over, and as we sign up, we also sign in with the same motion. As a user, I really appreciate this experience. By the way, this is the user button component we embedded previously. It renders the user's avatar and username, and it provides a way for the user to sign out. The Clerk account portal, which we just used to sign up and sign in, is great. Very quick to get started with, and even though we won't be going into it today, there are straightforward options available in the dashboard to use your own domain, refine the branding, and remove the Clerk logo if you want. That's literally a switch in the dashboard, by the way. However, for all the speedy advantages the account portal affords, you might not necessarily want to redirect your user to create an account or to authenticate. Let's have a look at how we can make sign up and sign in part of our own Next application so that we can control the precise context in which those components appear and eliminate the external redirect, which might not be desirable for all situations. Before we go any further though, I'm going to pull up the Clerk documentation. As much as I'd like to say I know the Clerk API by heart, you will often catch me here in the docs searching information about components I'm using. The docs are productive to reference in general, but you also learn new stuff. For instance, did you know Sign In button has a modal mode that skips the account portal altogether? This is handy in a pinch. I think it looks great, but it's not exactly what I had in mind. With the modal, the trade-off is that you can't link to the sign up or sign in directly, and besides, you might want to do something more custom. Maybe like this, where you present a quote or some figures that aim to improve the conversion rates of the page. If we want more control, we want the sign up components, and it looks a bit like this. To use the sign up components, first create a new route called sign up, and then a page that renders the sign up components in a centered container. Let's head to sign up manually and take a look. Seems great, except there is an error alerting us that the sign up component is not configured correctly. This is absolutely correct, but I wanted to show you the consequence of this error before we resolve it. Say we sign up and press continue. You might be expecting to see the email verification code input like we saw earlier. However, while the URL is updated, the page is a 404. This happens because our Next app only knows about the sign up route specifically. Next does not know what to do if the path has additional segments, like the verify email segment we see here. The solution is to create an optional catch-all segment and move page.tsx within it, like so. The error is now gone, and we can continue the sign-up process successfully, all within the context of our own application. If you happen to be curious what would happen if the user tried to sign up when they're already signed in, Clerk ensures the user is redirected to the homepage. Implementing the sign-in page is an almost identical process. You use the sign-in components instead of sign up. Once again, you need to take care to use an optional catch-all segment as well. Now, I know it must be tempting to click sign in the top right there, but for the moment, we need to navigate to sign in manually if we are to see the components in action. Everything seems to be working great. The problem with that sign in button is that it still takes us to the account portal. Simply put, Clerk doesn't yet know you've created your own sign up and sign in pages. To inform Clerk, we do that with Next public environment variables called sign in URL and sign up URL respectively. Now, when we go back to the browser, the sign in button works beautifully, and so does the link to sign up, which previously would have taken us to the account portal as well. Next, let's learn how to access the user's username with code. This is important if we want to render the user's username in a component, or maybe use it for some API request. At the moment, we can see the name and the user button, and by the way, another tip developers usually find delightful when I show them is that you can set the show name prop on user button to render the username alongside the button. Pretty nice. But say you want to access the username with code. Well, because we've set up the Clerk middleware, to access the username, all we have to do is call the asynchronous currentUser function from a server-side component. This function returns a user object that contains a bunch of data about the user, including their username. I'm going to use this username to personalize the hello message if the user is signed in. Two things to note. First, this is only applicable in server-side components. If you're using a client-side component in Next, you'll have to take a different approach. Second, the currentUser function behind the scenes makes a backend API request to Clerk, so it is subject to Clerk API rate limits. Probably not a problem unless you have a lot of traffic, but I wanted you to be aware just in case. Okay, so we can sign up, sign in, and we can access user data like the username from server-side components. Another fundamental pillar of Next authentication is how to protect specific pages so that unauthenticated users cannot access them. The conventional way to do this with Clerk is to augment the middleware. First, create a Clerk routes matcher and declare the array of routes you want to protect from unauthenticated users. I want to protect any routes beginning with /words. Next, update the Clerk middleware with a function that checks if the route is protected, and if so, call auth, then protect. Now, when I reload the words page, or otherwise navigate there, I'm prompted to sign in. Let's now bring all of this together and implement the word saving functionality. Once we do that, we will have successfully built an authenticated Next application from the ground up, and in not much time at all. On the left, you can see the words page component, and it embeds a create word form you haven't seen yet. I'm not going to show its code in this video, but you can find it in the project source code linked in the description. All you need to know for the purposes of this tutorial is that when the user submits the form, the server action on the right-hand side here is executed. Now, to associate a word in the database with the user, we of course need to know the ID of the user who is submitting it. In other words, we need to know the authenticated user's ID. We could utilize the currentUser function like we did before when we accessed the username. However, because currentUser incurs a backend request, if we only need the user ID and not the username, I would advise that you use the auth function instead, which returns information about the current session, including the user ID from a local copy. If you're wondering where this add word function comes from, I implemented a very simple JSON database that saves the word in a flat db.json file. Hence, when I submit the form, then open the db.json file, here we'll see the word and the ID of the user who submitted it. It would be advantageous, I would say, if we rendered the words on the page instead of having to open the database file. To do that, again, we need to know the current user's ID, and we'll access it with the auth function. Equipped with the user ID, we can now fetch and render the authenticated user's saved words. For good measure here, I'm going to change users and confirm that each user has their own independent word list. We can also see that reflected in db.json.